They sent me here to die. The earth kept me alive.
There is a kind of cold that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with wind or warning. It simply settles the way a stone settles into riverbed, slowly, completely, with the full weight of the earth behind it. The people of Providence Flats, Colorado Territory would come to understand that kind of cold in January of 1877. But that understanding would cost them everything they thought they knew. This is the story of what they learned. And it begins, as most hard lessons do, not with the cold itself, but with the cruelty that came before it. Picture a man standing before a room full of people holding a sheet of paper as though it were a deed to the world. Aldrich Dunmore was that kind of man. He did not need to raise his voice. Power, when it has been held long enough, speaks in a quiet register. He stood at the head of the Providence Flats Town Council on the morning of October 14th, 1876, and he did not look at the young woman standing before him as he read the words that would unmake her life. The debt of Emerson Langley, he said, amounts to $112. The assessed value of the property, including the cabin and the associated 160 acres, is $105. The council finds it necessary to reclaim the land as collateral. He paused to straighten his spectacles. The town, he added, is being generous. Generous. The word landed in the stale air of the town hall like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it made were invisible to everyone in that room except the young woman it was aimed at. Opaline Langley was 19 years old. She had been a widow for 6 weeks. Her husband Emerson had been killed by a falling ponderosa pine on a Tuesday afternoon in early September, a freak accident in the timber stands north of their property, and in the week since his death, she had done what women in her position were expected to do. She had kept the house. She had managed the accounts. She had not wept in public. She had presented herself to the world as composed and capable and entirely self-sufficient because she understood in the wordless way that young women on the frontier understood such things, that composure was the only currency she had left. It was not enough. Reverend Waverly sat to Dunmore's left, his hands folded over his considerable girth, his expression arranged into something he believed resembled compassion. "It is a sad providence," he said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man who delivers difficult news from a position of comfort, a test of faith. But the laws of man, like the laws of God, must be respected. Order must be maintained. To Dunmore's right sat Branson Stanton. He was not a young man. 20 years of building had thickened his hands and creased the corners of his eyes into permanent squints, the kind that come from a lifetime of measuring things against the horizon. He had been Emerson Langley's friend. He had taught Emerson how to swing an axe, how to read the grain of timber, how to set a foundation so it would hold against frost, heave, and spring flood alike. He had attended the funeral. He had shaken Opaline's hand afterward and told her Emerson was a good man, which was true, and said nothing more, which was not enough. He was saying nothing now, too. His eyes were fixed on the floorboards. His hands, thick and calloused, incapable, rested on his knees and did not move. Opaline looked at each of them in turn. The banker who held the deed, the reverend who held the moral authority, the carpenter who held her gaze for exactly 0 seconds. She breathed in once through her nose, slowly, the way her grandmother had taught her to breathe when the world required steadiness. "I see," she said. 2 words. She turned and walked out, and the door closed behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The town in its charity had offered her use of the old trapper's shack down by Whisper Creek. It stood on unclaimed land, they said, and they would overlook the squatting for the season. For the season meant until spring if she survived. The shack was 12 feet by 14 feet of rotting timber and collapsed ambition, a ruin so complete that the local porcupines had abandoned it years ago in favor of better accommodations. The roof was riddled with gaps. The single window was a gaping hole where glass had once been. There was no floor, only packed earth, already damp and cold at mid-morning, and a smell of old decay that thickened toward the corners. Opaline stood in the doorway of this place and understood something with the particular clarity that comes only from having no alternative. She was going to die here if she did not do something that no one in Providence Flats could yet imagine. But before the shack, before the creek, before any of that, she did 2 things. The first was to go to the general store. She carried with her the last item of value she possessed. It was a small gold locket on a thin chain The kind of peace that a young man buys when he wants to say something too large for words. Emerson had given it to her the winter before they were married, and inside the catch was a small, pressed wildflower he had fitted carefully behind the glass. She had worn it every day since. She stood at the store counter and placed it in front of the proprietor without ceremony, and she received $7 for it, which was less than it was worth and more than she had any right to expect. She spent $6.52 on 20 rough-cut pine planks, a box of nails, and 3 sections of 6-inch terracotta drainage pipe. She arranged for the materials to be carted to the edge of town and went to collect them herself because she could not afford the delivery fee to the shack. She had $1.48 left to her name when she walked out of that store. She did not look back at the locket on the counter. The second thing she did was walk slowly past the window of Dunmore's bank on her way out of town. Not to look in, not to make a point. She walked past it deliberately, letting herself feel the full weight of what had been taken, so that she would not spend the coming weeks in the comfortable fog of grief. Grief was a luxury. She stored the anger instead, the clean, cold kind, and she carried it with her down the road toward Whisper Creek like a coal she intended to keep lit. That first night in the shack was the night everything that was soft in her broke open and then closed again, harder. The cold came up through the earth beneath her and into her bones with a patience that felt almost personal. She had piled every blanket she owned at the top of herself, and still she could feel it, that upward seeping cold, that slow leaching of warmth from the ground into her body, as though the earth itself was hungry. She had built a small fire in the cast iron stove she had salvaged from the old cabin, but the heat rose straight to the ceiling and was sucked out through the gaps in the roof, and the floor remained what it had always been, a block of cold pressing steadily against the living world above it. She lay awake for a long time. She let herself cry once briefly, not from fear but from fury, the kind that comes when you realize that the people who wronged you were not even paying attention when they did it. Then she wiped her face. She sat up. She reached into her saddlebag and took out the things she had brought with her from the cabin, besides the tools and the bedroll and the kitchen implements. It was a small leather-bound book, its spine cracked with use, its pages filled from edge to edge in a script so fine it looked at first like a kind of lace. Her grandmother Agnes Langley had written that book over the course of many winters, in the shorthand of a woman who assumed she would always be there to explain it. Agnes had come from a hard country and had carried the knowledge of it in her hands and her memory, and she had passed some of that knowledge to Opaline in the years when Opaline was young enough to sit still and old enough to remember. The book was the rest of it, the part Agnes had written down for safekeeping. Opaline held the book without opening it. She pressed it against her chest and felt the cold earth beneath her, and understood with the certainty of someone who has run out of other options exactly what she was going to do. She was going to ask the earth for warmth, and she was going to dig until she found it. The next morning, she walked into Providence Flats one more time to arrange for her materials. She held her head straight, and she did not rush, and she did not look at anyone unless spoken to, and she was spoken to very little because people in small towns understand instinctively the social geometry of a woman whose property has just been repossessed, and most of them had no desire to stand too close to that particular shape. At the general store, she encountered Sophronia Dunmore, who was purchasing a spool of thread. Sophronia was a composed woman of 38, handsome in the way of people who have learned to hold their faces carefully over a long time. She was the wife of Aldrich Dunmore and had been for 18 years, and she wore that fact the way one wears a garment that no longer quite fits with a kind of dignified accommodation. She looked at the pile of materials Opaline had assembled on the counter. The terracotta pipe sections, the planks, the nails. Her eyes moved over them with a directness that most women in Providence Flats would have been embarrassed to show. "What are those for?" she asked, not loudly, not in the way of someone making conversation. Opaline met her gaze. "To live," she said. Sophronia said nothing for a moment. Then she nodded a single slight movement and turned back to her thread. She did not buy it. She set it down and left the store without purchasing anything at all, and Opaline watched her go and stored that detail alongside everything else she was carrying. On the morning of the 17th of October, Opaline drove the first pickaxe blow into the floor of the shack. She had marked out a rectangle in the center of the dirt 3 feet wide and 8 feet long, and she worked from the center outward, first with the pickaxe to break the hard crust, then with the shovel to move the loosened earth. The topsoil came up easily. Below it was dense clay threaded through with river stone, and every blow of the pickaxe sent a shock up both her arms to her shoulders. She had spent her adult life keeping a home and tending a kitchen garden, and her hands were not made for this kind of work. By mid-morning, the blisters had formed. By noon, they had opened. She wrapped them in strips of cloth and kept going. The principle she was working from was one her grandmother had called the warmth corridor. Agnes had encountered it first in a country far colder than Colorado, where certain old structures had been built with subterranean channels running from deep underground into the living space above. The idea was this: the Earth at sufficient depth maintains a constant temperature regardless of what the air above it does. In the mountain country of Colorado, that depth was roughly 6 feet below what builders called the frost line, the deepest point to which surface cold could penetrate the soil. Below the frost line, the ground held steady at somewhere between 38 and 42 degrees Fahrenheit year-round without exception, cold by summer standards. But in the grip of a killing winter, 40 degrees was not cold. 40 degrees was survival. If a channel could be dug from that stable depth all the way to the interior of a dwelling, the physics of the thing would do the rest. Cold air is heavier than warm air. The colder air inside the room would naturally sink and flow outward through a low vent, drawing the slightly warmer underground air, and up behind it through the channel into the space beneath the floor and up through gaps in the floorboards. Not a roaring heat, not even warmth by any comfortable standard, but a floor that stayed above freezing, a room where the bone-deep cold that came from the ground itself was interrupted before it could begin. Agnes had sworn by it. The modern builders of Providence Flats, with their seasoned timber and their granite fireplaces, would have called it superstition. Opaline called it the only plan she had. The channel needed to run 67 feet from the center of the shack down the gentle slope toward Whisper Creek, ending at a point well below the winter water line, where the creek bank held its warmth deep into the gravel. It needed to be 8 feet deep at the far end, not 6 as she had initially calculated. She had corrected this figure from a small note she had found, slipped under the door of the shack on the third morning, written in a hand she recognized from the construction documents Emerson had brought home from Branson Stanton's workshop. 8 feet, not 6. She had held that slip of paper for a long time before tucking it into the back of Agnes's book. On the 6th day, she had visitors. She was waist-deep in the pit when the shadow fell across the doorway, and she looked up to find Branson Stanton and Reverend Waverly standing at the threshold. Branson was a large man, solid in the way of someone who had spent decades in physical labor, and he filled the frame of the doorway in a way that made the small shack feel smaller. He looked at the pit. He looked at the pile of excavated earth outside. He looked at the terracotta pipe stacked against the wall. His expression was the expression of a craftsman encountering work he has already decided is wrong. "This is not a foundation," he said. "A foundation goes under the walls. You are digging a sump pit. Come spring, you will have standing water in here." "The channel will run downhill to the creek," Opaline said. Her voice was level. "It is for air, not water." Branson made a sound in the back of his throat that communicated without any ambiguity that this was the most foolish thing he had heard in recent memory. He kicked at a clod of loosened earth. "You need a cord of seasoned oak and a working stove, not a hole in the ground." He paused. Emerson would have known better. He said it without viciousness. That was in some ways worse. He said it as a statement of fact, a reminder of what she had lost and what she therefore lacked, as though grief were a technical deficiency that could be cited in an assessment. "My grandmother taught me some things," Opaline said quietly. Reverend Waverly shook his head from the doorway. "Old wives' tales," he said. "The Lord provides through honest work and sound principles. Mrs. Dunmore is in need of help in her kitchen. The congregation would see you placed." It was the offer they had been planning since before the ink was dry on the council's decision. A kitchen position, a place of managed dependency wrapped in the language of charity. Opaline drove the shovel back into the hard clay. "Thank you for your concern, Reverend," she said, and did not look up again. The two men left without another word, and Opaline listened to their footsteps recede and then stood alone in the pit with the shovel and the cold earth and the silence. She thought about Branson's hands, which she had watched during the council meeting, how they had rested motionless on his knees the whole time, how he had not once lifted his eyes from the floor. She thought about the slip of paper with the correction he had sent her in secret. She went back to work. It was on the 14th day that the earth tried to stop her. She had reached the section of the channel nearest the creek bank, where the soil changed from clay to a mixture of sand and riverstone, and it was in this section that she came in one morning to find 4 feet of her channel had collapsed overnight. The sandy walls had simply given way and filled the passage she had spent 2 days cutting through them. She stood at the edge of the cave in and looked at it for a long time. She did not pick up the shovel. Not yet. She sat down on the edge of the pit and put the shovel across her knees and let herself think clearly, which is different from thinking hopefully. She had spent 14 days on this. Her hands were a map of damage. She had perhaps 5 weeks before the real cold arrived, and she was looking at a cave, and that represented the loss of at least 2 of those days, plus the time it would take to figure out why it had happened and how to stop it from happening again. She opened Agnes's book. She turned to the section on unstable channels. The earth does not betray those who learn its language, Agnes had written, in the careful script of someone who had learned most of what she knew the hard way. Shore the walls with flat stone. Opaline closed the book. She sat with the closed book in her hands and the cold pit in front of her, and she asked herself the question she had been avoiding since October 14th, what if this does not work? It was not a small question. It contained within it the possibility of her own death, which is a thing that a 19-year-old mind could approach as carefully the way you approach a fire at night, close enough to see it, not close enough to feel the full heat. She sat with it for what felt like 10 minutes, but might have been 5. She did not arrive at any grand resolution or surge of courage. She arrived instead at a simpler conclusion: if she was wrong, she would die having tried. That was preferable to the alternative. She stood up. She picked up the shovel. She climbed down into the collapsed section. It took her 2 days to clear the cave in and shore the walls with flat stones hauled from the creek bed 30 yards away, carried in a bucket 1 trip at a time. While she was pulling stones from the shallows, her boots soaked through and her feet went numb, and she worked through the numbness because there was nothing else to do. And then she found it. The laced vein of clay that had caused the collapse ran at an angle through the sandy substrate, not straight as Agnes's diagrams had suggested, but diagonal, cutting across her intended route at roughly 15 degrees. If she followed her original line, she would be fighting this unstable layer the entire way to the creek. But if she adjusted the channel 15 degrees to the west, she would arc around the problematic clay entirely. The adjusted route would also bring her outlet into contact with a deeper gravel bed, one that sat directly above the section of creek where the spring-fed current ran fastest year-round. A more stable thermal source than anything she had originally aimed for. The ground had not failed her. It had redirected her. She adjusted her route and kept digging. Meanwhile, in a workshop on the main street of Providence Flats, a man was losing sleep for the first time in years. Branson Stanton did not consider himself a man given to doubt. Doubt was a poor tool. It accomplished nothing, and it cost time, and it had no place in a well-run workshop. He had built 43 structures in the Providence Flats Valley over 20 years, not counting outbuildings and additions, and every one of them had stood, and every one of them had been built on the same foundational principles he had learned as an apprentice and refined through experience and defended when challenged. He knew what he knew. But on the day he had stood in the doorway of that shack and looked at the pit Opaline Langley was cutting through the earth, something had caught at the back of his mind like a nail in fabric, small and sharp and impossible to ignore. He had gone back to his workshop after that visit and pulled out the plans. He was working on a new house for a family that had come up from Denver looking for land. He had sat in front of those plans for an hour with a pencil in his hand. The pencil made no marks. He knew the dimensions of what she was digging. He had calculated it automatically the way a craftsman calculates everything he sees: volume of spoil, approximate length and depth, the man-hours involved. He knew that what she was attempting was the work of 4 strong men over 3 weeks, and she was doing it alone, and the numbers made no practical sense, and yet the channel was visibly growing. He had taken a fresh sheet of paper that evening and done something he had never done in his professional life. He had tried to sketch out what her system would look like from the inside, where the channel entered the building, how the air would move, what the temperature differential would need to be to drive passive circulation. He was not an engineer. He did not have the mathematics for it, but he was a man who had spent 20 years thinking about how buildings interacted with the ground they sat on, and when he sketched the cross-section of her proposed system, when he traced the path the air would take from the deep, stable earth up through the channel and into the space beneath the floor, Something in the geometry of it felt not foolish, but familiar. The way a good joint feels when it slides together correctly, as though the pieces had always been meant to fit. He folded the sketch and did not throw it away. He put it in the back of his account book where no one would look, and he went home and he lay awake in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about floors. His son Keaton was 9 years old and possessed of the particular fearlessness of boys who have not yet learned to be embarrassed by curiosity. He had been watching the woman at the creek from a distance for weeks, the way children watch anything that the adults around them seem anxious about, which is to say with full and uncomplicated attention. In late October, he tripped on the creek path and tore open his knee on a root, and Opaline had seen him limping and brought him inside and cleaned the wound and wrapped it with the efficient gentleness of someone who has done this before. Keaton sat in the shack while she worked and looked at everything with the systematic attention of a boy constructing a mental inventory. He pointed at the iron grate set into the new floorboards. "What is that for?" he asked. Opaline tied off the bandage. She thought about how to explain it. "The earth under this floor is warmer than the air above it in winter," she said. "I built a channel to carry that warmth up here. The heavier cold air in the room sinks and pushes out through a vent, and the earth sends up something warmer to take its place." Keaton considered this with complete seriousness. "Like how a dog lies right on the ground when it is cold," he said, "to get the warmth." Opaline looked at the boy. "Yes," she said, "exactly like that." That evening, Keaton told his father what the woman at the shack had explained. Branson listened without interrupting. When Keaton Home was done, Branson sent him to bed and went to his account book and unfolded the sketch. He read it again. He thought about the image his son had given him, a dog lying flat on cold ground, seeking the warmth stored just beneath the surface. He was still thinking about it when the first serious snow of the season fell in early December. He went that week to check on the house he had just completed for the family from Denver. A house he considered among his best work-tight joinery and a substantial granite fireplace, and chinking done with a mixture of clay and horsehair that he had used for years without complaint. The family reported that the upstairs was comfortable, but the ground floor was difficult, that the boards were cold enough to hurt bare feet, and that they were burning through their woodpile faster than they had planned. Branson inspected every joint. He checked the chinking. He looked at the firebox, draw, and the window casings and the foundation sill. Nothing was wrong, and yet the floor was a sheet of cold radiating upward into the room, and no amount of fire above it was going to change that because the cold was not coming from above. It was coming from below. He drove home in his wagon and said nothing to his wife and ate dinner without tasting it. Later that evening, he stood in his own workshop, which he had built himself, and which he knew as well as he knew his own hands, and he looked down at his own floor. The floor he had stood on for 15 years without a second thought, and he tried to remember the last time he had thought about what was underneath it. He could not remember. He had never thought about it. The floor was the floor. You built it. It held. That was what floors did. He looked at the wall where he kept his best tools hung in order. He thought about the woman down by the creek, working alone in the November cold, digging a channel that every sensible person in Providence Flats had agreed was the project of someone who did not know what they were doing. He thought about the fold of paper in his account book and the sketch he had made and the numbers that kept adding up to something he was not yet ready to name. Outside, the first serious cold of winter pressed against the walls of his workshop, and the fire in the small corner stove worked hard against it, and the floor under his feet was exactly as cold as the ground outside. The snow that fell on the 2nd of December was the polite kind. It came down in steady silence, covered the dead grass and the 2 inches of white, and stopped before morning. The people of Providence Flats woke to a clean, bright world and went about their business with the comfortable certainty of those who have survived many winters and expect to survive many more. Opaline Langley stood outside the shack without her coat on and held out her palm and let the last few flakes settle on it. She was not being careless, she was measuring. The density of the snow, the temperature at which it fell, the way it sat on the sod roof she had spent a week building up against the shack's exterior walls. 3 inches of packed snow over sod was better insulation than most timber walls in this valley. Every inch that fell and stayed was one less inch of cold she had to fight from inside. She went back in and made a note in the margin of Agnes's book. Then she sat down with a stub of pencil and worked through her remaining supplies against the calendar. She had perhaps 6 weeks of flour and dried beans. Her snares along the creek had been producing 2 or 3 rabbits a week. Her woodpile, which she had built by hauling deadfall from the timber stands above the creek, was smaller than anyone in town would have considered adequate for a Colorado winter. But she was beginning to understand that adequate by the town's standards and adequate by the standards of her floor were two very different calculations. The floor was working. She had confirmed this 2 weeks earlier with the simplest test she could devise. She had left a tin cup of water on the boards overnight when the outside temperature dropped to 12 below. In the morning, the water was still liquid, not warm, not comfortable, but liquid, which meant the floor was holding above 32 degrees even when the air outside was cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. She had not announced this to anyone. She had simply poured the water into her kettle and started her day. The first real test came in the second week of December when the temperature dropped to 10 below and stayed there for 4 consecutive days. In town, people doubled their wood consumption and complained about drafts. Opaline's small stove, fed with modest portions of her carefully managed woodpile, kept the interior at a steady 55 degrees. She wore 1 layer of wool instead of 3. She slept without every blanket she owned piled on top of her. She worked on mending and reading and writing in the margins of Agnes's book. And the floor beneath her feet did what it was built to do quietly and without spectacle. She was sitting outside splitting kindling on the afternoon the shadow fell across the snow in front of her. She looked up. Aldrich Dunmore was standing at the edge of the path alone without Boone, without the formal posture he wore in the town hall. He was wearing a heavy coat and his hat was pulled low, and he looked for once like a man who had walked somewhere on his own 2 feet rather than arriving by arrangement. He was looking at her woodpile. Then he looked at her. He stepped closer without being invited. He stood in the doorway of the shack for a moment looking in at the floor, the small stove with its modest fire, the neat arrangement of a life managed carefully in a very small space. His eyes moved over everything with the assessing quality of a man who has spent his life calculating the value of things, and Opaline watched him do it and said nothing. "You have done something to this place," he said. It was not a question. "I improved the foundation," Opaline said. She kept splitting. The axe came down clean. Dunmore stepped inside without being invited. He looked at the grate in the floor for a long moment. "My wife noticed your woodpile," he said. "She mentioned it to me." He paused over the word mentioned in a way that contained considerably more information than the word itself. "I want to know how you are doing it." This was the most dangerous thing he had said to her since October 14th. Not because it was threatening, because it was interested. Aldrich Dunmore's interest was a different instrument than his authority, and in some ways it was sharper. Opaline set the axe down. She looked at him directly the way she had looked at him in the town hall, with the steadiness of someone who has nothing left to perform for an audience. "You took my land," she said. "You took my house. You took the first 6 weeks of my widowhood to sign paperwork." She picked the axe back up. "I do not owe you an explanation of anything." He was quiet for a beat. Then he nodded the single nod of a man filing information. "Fair enough," he said. He turned toward the door. He paused with his back to her. "The winter this year is going to be different," he said. "Not like the others." He said it without drama, like a man reporting a fact he had learned from someone he trusted. Then he walked out and did not look back. Opaline stood in the shack after his footsteps faded and held the axe and thought about those words. Dunmore was not a man who spoke imprecisely. If he said it was going to be different, he had a reason for saying so. The question was, what kind of reason? She went back outside and looked at the sky, the particular shade of it over the northern ridge, and she thought about Agnes's journal, the entries from the hard winters, the way Agnes described the sky before the worst of them. Then she went back inside and looked at her woodpile with new arithmetic. It was not going to be enough. Not if he was right. She spent the next 3 days hauling deadfall. Her back had not fully recovered from the digging, and the hauling worked different muscles in ways that expressed their objection clearly. But she loaded her small cart and pulled it and unloaded it and went back for more. And by the end of the 3rd day, her woodpile was larger than it had been, though still not large by anyone else's standards. It was on the second of those hauling days that she came back to find a small cloth-wrapped bundle sitting on the path near her door. She picked it up. Inside was $3 in coins and a folded piece of paper with 4 words on it in a hand she had seen once before over a spool of thread in a general store. "For what it is worth." No name. But Opaline had a precise memory for handwriting. She stood with the $3 in her palm and thought about what it meant that Sophronia Dunmore, wife of the man who had dispossessed her, was sending money to her door in secret. Not pity money, she decided. Pity money did not come wrapped in cloth. This was the action of a woman who had assessed a situation and made a judgment and acted on it without the freedom to do so openly. She put the coins in her tin and the paper in Agnes's book and said nothing to anyone. 3 days later, Aldrich Dunmore appeared at the general store and found the receipt for the withdrawal. The conversation that followed happened behind the closed door of the Dunmore house on the eastern end of Providence Flats, and no one outside those walls heard it, but the shape of it could be inferred from what came after. Sophronia Dunmore did not deny what she had done. She had not built 18 years of marriage to this man by being careless about facts. She had simply acted on a conclusion she had reached privately and was prepared to defend. She is 19 years old, Sophronia said. She is a widow on land that you took. That was a legal debt, Dunmore said. I administered it correctly. Sophronia looked at her husband in the way she had not looked at him in several years directly, without the accommodation that had become habitual between them. If she dies on that land, Aldrich, this town will remember who put her there, and you know that. He was a man who understood leverage. This was leverage. He filed it where he filed all information that required a response he was not yet ready to give, and he said nothing more that evening, and he did not cancel the plan he had been developing for a further legal action against Opaline's use of the public land. But he moved the timeline. He put it further out. Opaline would never know about that conversation. What she would know later was that no further legal papers arrived before the storm. It was in the last days of December that Keaton Stanton came back. He appeared on the creek path on a cold afternoon with his hands in his pockets and a faint residual limp from the knee that had healed mostly but not entirely. He stood in the doorway of the shack with the ease of a child who has decided a place belongs to the category of safe, and Opaline let him stand there while she worked on the insulation she was adding to the north wall. He watched her for a while. Then he told her what his father had said when Keaton had described the system to him at home. His father had not said much. He had asked 2 questions. What direction did the channel run, and how deep was it at the far end? Opaline kept working. What did you tell him, she said. Keaton recited the numbers with the accuracy of a boy who had understood that the numbers mattered. Opaline said nothing for a moment. Then she asked, did he say anything after that? He did not say anything. Keaton said, he just went and got a piece of paper. The boy stayed for an hour and helped her pack clay into the gaps between the sod bricks on the north wall, which he did with more precision than she expected and less patience, which was about right for 9 years old. When he left, she stood in the doorway and watched him walk back up the path toward town, his breath clouding in the cold air, and she thought about a man sitting alone with a piece of paper and 2 numbers he had not been looking for. January arrived with a drop in temperature that the older residents of Providence Flats noted with unease. Not the cold itself, which was within the range of what they had seen before, but the quality of it, a dryness and a stillness that the experienced read as a held breath. The sky on clear days was a hard pale blue, with no warmth in it, and the creek ran slower than usual for this time of year. Branson Stanton finished his contracts for the month and found himself with an afternoon free, which rarely happened. He did not go to the tavern. He went to his workshop and took out the account book and unfolded the sketch he had made in November. He had been back to it several times since. He had added notations, crossed things out, redrawn the cross-section from a different angle. He was not an engineer and the drawing was crude, but the logic of it had grown clearer the more he returned to it, not because he understood it better in theory, but because in January the floor of his workshop was so cold that he had taken to wearing his boots indoors. And every morning he crossed that cold floor, he felt the absence of something he had not previously thought to provide. He was thinking about this standing at his workbench with the sketch in his hand when he heard the sound of Boone's horse outside. Boone came in without knocking, which was his custom, and stood in the middle of the workshop with the look of a man delivering a message he has not entirely made peace with. He carried a folded document. He told Branson that Dunmore had found a different legal basis for the removal action. Not the land use ordinance, which the girl had apparently found a hole in, but an earlier provision regarding the diversion of natural watercourses. The channel she had dug terminated at the creek bank. Dunmore's lawyer in Denver believed that constituted a modification of a natural waterway without permit, which was actionable. Boone said this flatly, without investment. He seemed to be reporting it rather than endorsing it. Branson looked at this man. He looked at the document. He thought about the sketch in his hand. He thought about the floor of his workshop. When he asked, Boone said Dunmore intended to have the papers delivered to the woman at the end of the week. After that, she would have 30 days to vacate before the matter went to the district judge in the spring. After Boone left, Branson stood at his workbench for a long time without moving. Then he folded the sketch and put it in his coat pocket instead of back in the account book, and he went home and said nothing to his wife about any of it, and he lay awake that night, listening to the wind that had begun to pick up from the north, carrying with it a sound that he could not quite name, but that sat in his chest in a way he did not like. 2 days before Boone was scheduled to deliver the documents, the sky above the northern ridge turned the color of a bruise. It was the 18th of January, a Thursday afternoon, and Opaline was stacking the last of her additional woodpile against the south wall of the shack when she noticed it. The snow had been falling since noon, not in flakes, but in small, hard pellets that ticked against the sod roof like 100 tiny clocks all running at different speeds. The temperature had been dropping since morning, faster than the usual afternoon pattern, and the wind was beginning to move in a way she associated with something she had only read about in the oldest entries of Agnes's book, a sustained directional push, rather than the variable gusts of a normal winter storm. She worked for another 10 minutes. Then she made a series of decisions with the calm efficiency of someone who has been mentally rehearsing for a possibility she hoped would not arrive. She carried 2 full armloads of wood inside. She checked the grate in the floor, clearing a thin rime of dust from the mesh. She filled every container she had with water from the creek, which was still running, and stacked them near the stove where they would not freeze. She blocked the last small gap above the door frame with a rolled piece of wool blanket. She looked at the stove, calculated the burn rate against the wood pile she had managed to accumulate, and decided she could afford a slightly larger fire tonight. Then she sat down and opened Agnes's book to the section she had been thinking about since Dunmore had said the words different this year on that December afternoon. Agnes had survived 3 hard winters. She had written about each of them. The third was the one she described in the most detail, the one she had not expected to survive, and the entry was long and precise and filled with observations that most people would not have thought to record. Opaline read it through twice slowly, then closed the book and looked at the fire, and thought about the families in their cabins up the slope toward Providence Flats. She thought about wooden floors and stone fireplaces, and heat that rose uselessly to the ceiling, while the cold ruled the ground beneath every pair of feet in town. She thought about houses full of children and firewood stacked in quantities that assumed a normal winter. She thought about Keaton Stanton. Outside, the temperature dropped 8 degrees in an hour. The hard pellets of snow became a sustained horizontal curtain, driven by a wind that had stopped being a wind and started being a presence. A constant force that pressed against every surface it met with the patience of something that had all winter and no particular deadline. By morning, Providence Flats was buried. In the Dunmore house on the east end of town, the largest and best appointed house in the valley, the fires in 2 fireplaces and a large cast-iron kitchen stove ran all night on the best seasoned hardwood money could obtain, and by dawn the ground floor was uninhabitable. The cold came up through the floorboards and claimed the lower half of every room regardless of what burned above it, and the family retreated upstairs to a single bedroom where they huddled together under every blanket in the house and listened to the windwork at the window frames. Aldrich Dunmore, who had managed debt and property and the legal mechanisms of a frontier town for 20 years, sat in the middle of a feather bed with his 2 children pressed against him, and understood for the first time in his adult life that there was a category of problem that money could not organize. In the Reverend's house, Waverly's library burned page by page. He had exhausted his woodpile on the first night and moved to furniture on the second, and by the third morning, he was feeding his books to the stoveworks of theology and philosophy, and biblical commentary turned to ash in a few minutes each, and his wife lay in the bed with a shallow, ragged quality to her breathing that he tried not to hear. He prayed. He prayed with the full commitment of a man who has no other tools available. The storm did not respond. In the workshop that Branson Stanton had built with his own hands over 3 years and considered the best structure in his portfolio, the temperature on the ground floor had dropped below 0 Fahrenheit by the second night. The nails in the walls contracted and popped, a sound like distant rifle shots, and the timbers groaned under stresses they had not been designed to absorb. He had built with good timber and true joints, and he had believed until now that this was enough. His wife and son were in the upstairs room. Keaton had been shivering since the first night. On the morning of the third day, the shivering stopped. Branson sat beside his son and put his hand on the boy's forehead. The skin was cold, not sleeping cold, the other kind. He had seen this before in other people in other winters. He knew what the stillness meant. A body that has stopped shivering has stopped fighting. He stood up. He went to the closet and pulled out every piece of heavy clothing he owned. He began putting it on in layers more than he had ever worn at once. His wife came to the bedroom door and watched him. "Where are you going?" she said. "To find Dunmore," he said. "Pool resources." He had never lied to her before. Not in 15 years. He could tell that she knew it by the way she looked at him, not with suspicion, but with something worse, a kind of frightened understanding. He went to the hall closet and took the coil of rope he kept there for winter emergencies. He tied one end to the porch railing, testing the knot twice. He looked back through the open door at the dark, cold house that he had built, the house that had failed him, and then he stepped outside. The world ceased to exist at 5 feet. Beyond that was nothing but white movement and noise, a sound so complete it stopped being sound and became environment, something you were inside of rather than something you heard. The cold struck him like a wall, not the polite cold of December or even the hard cold of an ordinary January night, but something categorically beyond those things, a cold that was not interested in negotiation. He wrapped his scarf tighter and turned his body in the direction he believed the creek to be and began to walk. He fell the first time in 20 feet. He found the rope and used it to get upright and kept going until the rope ran out. And then he was on his own, moving by the memory of the land slope downhill toward water, 1 foot, and then the other, with the wind pushing against him from a direction that kept shifting so that he could never lean into it consistently. He fell 11 more times. He counted them. He was not sure why he counted them. Perhaps because counting was the only ordered thing available. He had time in that crossing to think about a great many things. He thought about the families he had built houses for over 20 years. Good houses, houses he had been proud of. Houses that were right now either empty with cold or occupied by people who were losing their fight with it. He thought about the sketch in his coat pocket. The cross-section of a channel running from deep earth into a small wooden room. He thought about his son's forehead under his hand. He walked into the wall of the shack without seeing it. His outstretched hands hit the sod surface, and he stopped and stood for a moment with his palms flat against it, and even through his gloves he could feel that the wall was different from the snow around it. Not cold through and through, but something with more substance, more resistance. He found the door. He pushed. The silence arrived first. The storm's roar cut off so completely that for a moment Branson thought he had gone deaf. Then he registered the other thing, the thing he had not allowed himself to expect, the warmth. Not heat, not the aggressive warmth of a roaring fire. A settled, ambient, enveloping warmth that met him at the threshold and held. The air in this room was still, not trapped still, not the airless stillness of a sealed space, but calm, the way air is calm in a place that is at peace with its temperature. A single candle burned on the small table. In its light, Opaline Langley sat in the chair beside the stove, a shawl around her shoulders, Agnes's book open on her lap. She looked up. She did not look surprised. She looked, if anything, as though she had been expecting someone to arrive eventually, though perhaps not tonight, perhaps not through weather like this. Branson pulled the scarf from his face. His beard was solid with ice. He looked at her. He looked at the stove with its small, unhurried fire, and its modest wood pile standing nearby, barely diminished. He looked at the floor. He pulled off his glove. He knelt down on one knee the way a man kneels when he is not performing reverence but experiencing it, and he pressed his bare hand flat against the pine boards. The warmth came up through his palm like a pulse. Not fire warmth, not stored warmth. Continuous living, steady warmth rising from somewhere far below, from a depth he had not thought to reach from earth that had been warm before he was born and would be warm after he was gone. He had spent 20 years building above the ground. He had never once thought to ask what the ground itself might offer. How he said, the word came out in a voice he did not quite recognize as his own. Opaline closed her book. She looked at him with the direct, clear gaze of someone who has been right about something for a very long time and has not needed anyone to confirm it. The earth, she said, the earth is keeping us warm. Branson Stanton, master carpenter of Providence Flats, Colorado territory, knelt on the floor of the shack he had dismissed as a folly and a ruin. His bare hand pressed against boards that should have been cold and were not, and he did not speak again for a long moment. Outside, the storm pushed against the sod walls and found nothing to take. Inside, the candle burned without flickering. "My boy," Branson finally said. His voice broke on the second word. "He is not shivering anymore." Opaline set Agnes's book on the table. She stood up. "Then go and bring them here," she said. He had told his wife he was going to find Dunmore. Branson Stanton stepped back out into the storm, with that lie still sitting in his chest, and he followed the rope, hand over hand, back up the slope toward his house. And every step of that return journey was different from every step of the journey down. He was not moving through darkness toward a desperate hope anymore. He was moving through darkness toward his family with a specific knowledge of where safety was and how far away it stood. He burst through his own front door and found his wife kneeling beside Keaton on the floor of the upstairs room, her head bent, her shoulders in the posture of a woman who has stopped expecting good news. She looked up when she heard him. "Get his coat," Branson said. "Get yours. Bring every blanket you can carry." She did not ask him where. She looked at his face and she got up and she started moving. He went to the window and looked in the direction of the Dunmore house, invisible through the white curtain outside, and he made a calculation. The rope he had used would get them as far as the edge of his property. From there to Opaline's shack was open ground downhill, a distance a healthy man could cover in 4 minutes on a clear day. Tonight it had taken him an hour. With a woman and a sick child through this without a guide rope the full length of the way, it would be the most dangerous thing he had ever asked his family to do. He also knew what would happen if they stayed. He tied his wife's wrist to his own with a short length of cord. He carried Keaton against his chest, with both arms, the boy's face pressed into the wool of his coat. His wife gripped the back of his belt with her free hand. He told her not to let go for any reason, and he meant it. But before he led them out, he went next door. He hammered on the Dunmore door with his fist and kept hammering until Aldrich Dunmore opened it, a man unmade by 3 days of cold and fear. His hair disordered his eyes, carrying the stunned quality of someone who has discovered that the world contains threats his ledgers cannot record. Behind him, visible through the doorway, Sophronia stood with the 2 children already in their coats. She had known. Somehow, without anyone telling her, she had known that this moment was coming, and she had prepared for it. "Follow me," Branson said. "I found shelter." Dunmore stared at him. There was a negotiation happening behind his eyes, a man trying to reconcile his understanding of the social order with the specific physical reality of his situation. His money was in the safe. His authority was in the papers in his office. Neither of those things was warm. "I will not," Dunmore began. "Aldrich." Sophronia's voice came from behind him, quiet and final. The voice of a woman who has made her decision and is not presenting it for discussion. She was already moving toward the door with a child on each hand. Dunmore looked at his wife. He looked at his children. He looked at the fire in the downstairs room that had burned all night and done nothing useful against the cold pressing up through the floor. He put on his coat. On the way down the slope, Branson hammered on one more door. Reverend Waverly answered it with the hollowed look of a man whose faith in his firewood had both run out at roughly the same moment. His wife was behind him, wrapped in a quilt, her breathing audible from the doorway. She needed no convincing. She was already moving before Waverly had fully processed what was being offered. They came together in the storm, this ragged group, and Branson led them down the slope by memory and instinct, in the faint downward pull of the land, and they fell and helped each other up and fell again. And the children were silent in the way of children who understand, without being told, that this is not the moment for questions. When the sod wall of the shack appeared out of the white, several of them reached out to touch it, at the same moment needing the confirmation of something solid. Opaline opened the door before they reached it. She stood in the doorway with the candle behind her, and she did not look surprised, and she did not look triumphant. She looked at the group of people standing in the storm in front of her door. Half of them, the people who had sentenced her to this place, and she stepped back and held the door open and said nothing at all. They came in one by one, filling the 12 by 14-foot room with the mass and noise and smell of 17 people who had not been warm in 3 days. The children made sounds when the warmth reached them. Involuntary sounds, not quite words. The sounds of bodies registering relief before the mind has caught up. One of the Dunmore children sat down on the floor immediately and did not get up for a long time. Opaline put water on the stove. She distributed the remaining rabbit stew she had made that morning in portions that were smaller than any of them would have chosen under different circumstances, and not one of them complained. She arranged the children closest to the stove. She found places for adults to sit or lean. The shack that the town of Providence Flats had assigned to her as a sentence became, in the space of 20 minutes, something else entirely. Keaton Stanton's color came back before the hour was out. Branson was sitting on the floor beside his son when it happened, his back against the wall, watching the boy's face with the focused attention of a man who has narrowed his entire existence down to one data point. The gray quality in Keaton's skin began to change slowly, the way light changes in the early morning, not all at once, but incrementally, warmth returning to the surface. Keaton opened his eyes. He looked at his father. He said he was thirsty. Branson Stanton, who had built things for 20 years and prided himself on a steadiness of temperament that his trade required, pressed his face against the top of his son's head and did not speak for a considerable time. Opaline brought water. She set it down beside them and went back to attending the others without comment, and Branson watched her move through the crowded room with the efficiency of someone who has been practicing for exactly this, a woman who has turned a ruin into an ark and is now simply doing the work of keeping it afloat. Boone arrived on the second day. He knocked, which was unusual for him. When Opaline opened the door, he was standing in the storm in the attitude of a man who has come to a decision he is not proud of and is not going to pretend otherwise. She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back. He came in and stood near the door without removing his coat for a long time. He looked at the room, at Dunmore sitting on the floor with his children, at Reverend Waverly in the corner with his wife's head on his shoulder, at Branson Stanton sitting with his boy, the boy breathing steadily, a blanket around both of them. He looked at all of this for a while, and then he found a space against the far wall and sat down in it. That night, when the candle had burned down and been replaced, and the room was in the kind of quiet that comes when exhausted people have finally managed to sleep, Boone reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He took out the folded document he had been carrying since the 18th of January, the legal papers that would have given Opaline 30 days to vacate this place, the papers that Dunmore had prepared and Boone had been scheduled to deliver 3 days ago. He unfolded them in the near darkness. He read through them once, though he already knew what they said. Then he tore them slowly and carefully into small pieces and fed them one by one into the stove. He did it without looking around to see if anyone was watching. He did it the way a person does something they have decided they need to do, regardless of whether it is witnessed. When the last piece was gone, he closed the stove door and leaned back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and said nothing. The storm continued for 2 more days. In the compressed intimacy of the shack, things happened that would not have happened anywhere else. Sophronia Dunmore sat beside Opaline on the second afternoon, and they mended tears in the children's clothing, together side by side in the small way that shared work sometimes says what conversation cannot. At one point, Sophronia looked at Opaline's hands, the scarred and calloused and capable hands of a woman who had spent 3 months building something with them, and then she looked at her own hands, smooth and unmarked, the hands of a woman who had spent the same 3 months inside a well-appointed house. She was quiet for a moment. "I sent you the money," she said. "I want you to know that I would do it again." Opaline kept working on the hem she was repairing. "You already paid part of that debt," she said. Sophronia understood what she meant. She nodded and did not say anything more, and they worked together in silence, which was, under the circumstances, the most honest kind of conversation available. On the morning of the 5th day, the storm broke. It did not diminish gradually. It stopped. The wind dropped in the space of an hour from a sustained force to nothing, and the silence that replaced it was so complete that people woke to it, pulled out of sleep by the absence of a sound that had been continuous for 4 days. Outside, the sky was a hard, clean blue, the kind of blue that exists only after enormous violence has been spent and the air has been scoured empty. Opaline opened the door of the shack and stood in the opening and looked at what the storm had made of the world. The valley was unrecognizable. The drifts ran in long, sculptured lines across the landscape, some of them higher than a man's head, shaped by the wind into forms that had a terrible beauty to them. The creek was still running, visible as a dark line through the white, still carrying the warmth from deep underground that had kept her floor alive through all of it. Her shack from outside looked like a feature of the land itself, a mound, a hill, an interruption in the snow that bore no obvious resemblance to a building made by human hands. The town of Providence Flats, a quarter mile up the slope, looked like a row of white lumps. The smoke that would normally have been rising from a dozen chimneys was absent. Most of those fires had gone out days ago. They walked up to this town in a group, picking their way through the drifts, and what they found there took the rest of that day to fully understand. Some houses had held, others had not. Windows had blown in. One roof had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. And in 3 houses, they found what Opaline had been afraid they would find when she sat reading Agnes's book on the night the storm began. 8 people, 3 families, frozen in homes that had been built correctly by every standard anyone in Providence Flats had ever applied. Good timber, solid foundations, proper fireplaces. They had done everything right by every measure they had been given, and the cold had come from below and claimed them anyway. Opaline stood in the doorway of the 3rd house and looked at what the cold had done and felt the weight of it settle over her, not guilt. She had not caused this, but grief of a particular kind. The grief of knowing that knowledge existed that could have prevented this and was not where it needed to be in time. She stood there long enough to make sure she would not forget it. Then she turned and walked back out into the cold blue morning. The town council meeting was called 2 days later once the roads were cleared enough to move and the dead had been attended to. It was held in the same room where the council had met in October, and the same chairs were arranged in the same way, but the people who filled those chairs and the walls around them had been fundamentally reorganized by what they had survived. Aldrich Dunmore stood at the front of the room. He was not holding any papers. He was not consulting any ledgers. He stood in front of the assembled surviving population of Providence Flats, and he looked at Opaline Langley, who stood near the back wall with her hands folded in front of her, and he held her gaze for a moment before he spoke. "I have been a fool," he said. His voice was steady, but it cost him something to keep it that way. "We have all been fools. We valued our understanding of things over evidence that our understanding was incomplete. We sent this woman to what we believe was her death, and in our certainty about what we knew, we nearly met that fate ourselves while she did not." He reached into his coat, he removed a document and held it up and then set it on the table. "The debt of Emerson Langley is hereby canceled. The deed to the property, the land, and the cabin is returned to Opaline Langley effective immediately with no further conditions attached." He paused. "That is a small thing," he said, "given what she has given this town in return." The room was very quiet. Then Sophronia Dunmore stood up. She rose from her seat in the section of the room where the women sat, which was not the custom, and she stood and turned to face the room without apology. "I want to say something," she said. "I helped Opaline Langley this winter. I sent her money in December, and I made that decision without my husband's knowledge." She paused, not for drama, but because she was choosing her next words carefully. "I would make that decision again. And I want that said in this room with everyone present, because I am tired of the things that matter being said only in private." Aldrich Dunmore looked at his wife. He did not look angry. He looked at her with the complicated expression of a man encountering, perhaps for the first time, the full dimensions of the person he had been married to for 18 years and finding them larger than he had previously measured. Reverend Waverly rose next. He was not a small man, and he had never made himself small, but he stood differently now than he had stood in October. He spoke about pride and about the specific failure of a man who preaches wisdom he has not tested. He had offered Opaline a kitchen position, he said, when what he should have offered was respect. He asked for her forgiveness and for the forgiveness of the congregation he had failed to adequately prepare for the winter that had just passed. Then Branson Stanton walked to the front of the room. He did not look at Dunmore or at Waverly or at the assembled faces watching him. He turned to face the room and he spoke in the voice of a man making a professional accounting of a professional failure, which for a craftsman of his experience was perhaps the most difficult kind of honesty available. 20 years, he said. I have built in this valley for 20 years. I believed I understood what a building needed. I understood timber and joint and load. He stopped. When the test came, the buildings failed. My building failed. I built above the ground for 20 years and never once asked what the ground itself had to offer. He turned. He looked at Opaline Langley directly the way he had not been able to look at her in October, the way he had been unable to look at Emerson's wife, across a room where a wrong was being done, and he had not found the courage to object to it. I ask you, he said, teach me how you did it. Teach us all. In the back of the room, Keaton Stanton looked up at the front where his father was standing, and he smiled. He had understood the principle 2 months ago. He had learned it on the floor of a small shack on Whisper Creek, from a woman with calloused hands who had explained it in terms of a dog lying on cold ground. He had carried the knowledge home and given it to his father without knowing what his father would do with it, and his father had sat with it in the dark for weeks while the world prepared to test it, and now here they were, and the test had come and gone, and everything his father had built before it needed to be reconsidered. There was something satisfying about that, not in a cruel way, in the way that things are satisfying when they resolve into the shape they were always moving toward. Opaline looked at Branson from the back of the room. She looked at him for a long moment, the man who had built houses for 20 years and sent her a secret correction on a slip of paper and then waited too long to do anything more. She looked at the room full of people who had assigned her to a ruin and were now asking her to teach them what she had learned in it. Yes, she said. That spring, the work began in earnest. The snow melted slowly, which was a mercy preventing the kind of flash flooding that a fast thaw would have brought down from the mountains. The creek returned to its full voice. The valley floor, which had been compressed under several feet of snow for weeks, emerged into the pale early spring light with a flattened, exhausted quality, as though the land too needed time to recover. Opaline moved back into her own house in March, the house that Emerson had built on the 160 acres that Aldrich Dunmore had taken and then returned. The house was smaller than she remembered, and the roof needed attention, and the floorboards in the main room it had warped over the winter, and she stood in the middle of it on the first morning and felt the particular complicated emotion of a person returning to a place that is both familiar and irrevocably changed. She brought Agnes's book with her. She set it on the kitchen table and made tea and sat with it, not reading but simply having it near. And she thought about her grandmother, who had never seen Colorado and had never imagined a granddaughter in a place like Providence Flats, and had nevertheless left behind the knowledge that saved 17 lives in a January storm. The first person to arrive at her door to learn was Branson Stanton. He came on a Tuesday morning in early April with his tools and without a plan, which was unlike him. He stood at the door and said he wanted to understand the full system from the beginning, not from what Keaton had described, not from the sketch he had made in November, but from the source. He wanted to stand where the channel entered the shack and trace it all the way to the creek. He wanted to understand the geometry of the thing, the depth in the slope, and the reason for the 15-degree western adjustment she had made when the clay layer had redirected her route. Opaline took him to the shack first. She showed him the grate in the floor and the plenum chamber beneath it, and the point where the channel entered from outside. She showed him the stone-lined passage she had built when she ran out of terracotta pipe. Flat stones overlapped like scales. Low parallel walls, a rough capstone cover. She showed him the outlet at the creek bank and the gravel layer she had packed above the channel for the full length of the trench. Branson walked the full 67 feet from the shack to the creek without speaking. He crouched at various points and looked at the construction. He pressed his palm to the earth beside the channel at the midpoint, trying to feel what the channel was drawing from the ground around it. He stood at the creek outlet for a long time looking at the water. He said finally the slope of the channel. "Show me how you calculated it." She explained the gradient, 1 inch of drop for every 10 feet of length, the angle that allowed passive airflow without creating so much draw that the system overcorrected. She showed him how she had used Emerson's spirit level against a long, straight plank, checking every few feet as she dug. Branson was quiet for a moment after this. Then he said Emerson kept that level sharp. "I lent it to him the year before he died." He said it like a man placing a small stone in a particular spot deliberately as a marker for something he was not yet ready to say in full. Opaline said nothing. She let him have the moment. Other students followed. 2 young carpenters who had apprenticed under Branson came on the 3rd day. A farmer named Aldous Crane came the following week, interested primarily in applying the principle to his root cellar and his livestock barn, both of which had been inadequately protected against the January cold. He was a practical man who asked practical questions and wrote down the answers in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket, and Opaline appreciated the directness of his attention. She taught the way Agnes had written without ceremony and without withheld knowledge. Everything she knew she gave out freely, because the logic of what she had learned was that it had value only if it spread. A system that saved one household was a good system. A system that saved a valley was something else. In late April, Branson Stanton appeared at the door of the Langley house on the 160 acres with a wagon carrying timber and tools and his two young apprentices. He told Opaline he was going to rebuild the foundation of the main house. He would keep the existing structure above the floor, which was sound, but beneath it he intended to build what he was now calling, in the careful language of a craftsman adopting new vocabulary, a thermal undercroft, a sealed plenum space fed by a deep channel cut to the proper depth and angle. He said this matter-of-factly, as though it were a job he had been contracted to do. Opaline asked him how much she owed him. Nothing, he said. Emerson was my friend. I should have done something like this a long time ago. He looked at the house, not at her. I built you a good roof and a solid frame, and I walked away, and that was not enough. He said it without self-pity and without expectation of absolution, simply as a fact he was now correcting. They worked together through the first 3 weeks of May. Branson and his apprentices above with their timber and tools, Opaline in the trench below, with her shovel and her level, and the accumulated knowledge of 3 months of solitary labor. It was different working with others. It was noisier and more complicated and occasionally frustrating, and it was also faster, and there were moments when the work had a quality of repair to it that went beyond the foundation they were building. Boone left Providence Flats on a Wednesday in the middle of April. He did not announce his departure or explain his reasons, which was consistent with how he had conducted most of his affairs. He simply settled his account at the boarding house and loaded his horse and rode out before most of the town was awake. He left something at the door of the shack on Whisper Creek before he went. When Opaline found it that morning, she stood and looked at it for a moment. It was a bundle of iron nails, new ones, the 6-inch variety used for heavy structural work. No note, no explanation, just nails which were what a person needed when they were building something, and which were as close to an apology as a man like Boone was equipped to offer. Summer arrived in the valley with the unhurried confidence of something that has been absent long enough to be appreciated. The creek ran high with snowmelt. The timber stands above town came back to green. The fields that had been buried since December showed their first growth in May, and by June were well along toward a harvest that would help replenish what the winter had consumed. The houses of Providence Flats were different that summer. Not all of them, not yet, but enough to be visible to anyone paying attention. Where trenches had been dug and channels laid and plenums built under floors, the families that lived in those houses moved differently, less contracted, less braced against an anticipated discomfort. Children played on the floors instead of staying elevated. People spent evenings in their ground floor rooms instead of clustering upstairs. In July, a letter arrived addressed to Opaline Langley, care of the Providence Flats General Store. It was from a civil engineer in Denver who had heard through the particular informal network by which useful information travels in frontier communities about the woman at Whisper Creek and her system for thermal heating. He asked if he might correspond with her on the matter. He had a project, a large one, and he believed the principles she had applied at a domestic scale might have applications at a scale she had not yet considered. Opaline read the letter at her kitchen table on a July afternoon, with the door open and the summer air moving through the room freely. She thought about Agnes, who had learned what she knew in a country she never named clearly in the journal, from people who had probably learned it from people before them, from a chain of transmission so long that its origin was lost in a time before memory. She thought about the shack on the creek and the 14 days of digging and the night she had sat with the shovel across her knees and asked herself what she would do if she was wrong. She went to her desk and took out paper and began to write a reply. She told the engineer, yes, she was willing to correspond. She told him that she worked from principles she had not invented but had applied in specific conditions, and that she would need to understand his project fully before she could tell him whether those principles were applicable. She told him she had documentation drawings and measurements and notes from the construction process, and that she would send what was relevant when she had a clearer picture of what he needed. She sealed the letter and set it aside to be sent with the next post. Then she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk and looked out the open door at the valley she had survived. Autumn came with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of axes, the familiar preparations of a community getting ready for winter. But the preparations that year had a different quality to them. There was calculation in them that had not been there before, for a more considered relationship between what the cold required and what the earth might offer in return. Trenches were dug before the ground froze. Channels were laid with the correct gradient, checked with levels that many of these men had never previously applied to anything below the surface. Branson Stanton walked his completed plenums with the critical attention of a craftsman, inspecting his own work and finding it adequate, which from Branson was a form of high praise. He had revised his methods, not abandoned them, the timber and the joints and the principles of above-ground construction that 20 years had refined but expanded them downward, added a dimension he had not previously included. He told his apprentices that a building's relationship with the ground it sits on is as important as any joint above it, and he said it without apparent awareness of where he had learned this, which was something Opaline noticed and found she did not mind. One afternoon in October, a year almost exactly after the council meeting that had sentenced her to the shack by the creek, Opaline walked the full length of the original channel she had dug. She started at the grate in the shack floor and walked the mounded earth down the slope to the creek outlet. The ground had settled evenly over the channel since she had backfilled it. There was no longer any visible sign of the work except a slight variation in the way grass had grown back over the disturbed soil, a faint darker green that followed the line of the trench from the shack to the water. She stood at the creek and looked back up the slope at the shack. She had not lived there since March, but she kept it in repair. She had replaced the roof section that had been weakest. She had repointed the sod wall on the north side where Winter had worked at the clay between the bricks. It was, she had decided, worth maintaining. Not as a dwelling, but as a record. A demonstration available to anyone who wanted to understand it of what a 19-year-old woman with a shovel and her grandmother's knowledge had built in 6 weeks of autumn on $1.48. She crouched at the water's edge and put her hand into the creek. The water ran cold over her fingers, fast and clear, fed by the mountain spring that never fully slept, even in the deepest winter. People asked her sometimes in the years that followed what had kept her going through the autumn of 1876, through the cold and the isolation and the knowledge that the town above her had already written her off as lost. She did not have a single answer to this question because there was not a single answer. There was the anger she had stored on the day she walked past Dunmore's bank window. There was Agnes's book and the voice in it that sounded like memory of a woman she had loved. There was the particular stubbornness of someone who has been told by people with authority that they are wrong and has decided to let the evidence decide. But if she was honest, what she came back to when she thought about the nights in October and November, when the cold pressed up through the ground and she lay awake with the math of her own survival running in her head, was something simpler than any of those things. She had put her hand on the ground, not looking up, not reaching out, not waiting for something outside herself to provide what she needed. She had put her hand on the ground, and she had felt even then, before the channel was dug and the floor was laid, that there was warmth there. Not much, not comfortable, but present, steady, reliable in the way that things which have been constant for centuries are reliable. The ground was always warmer than the air above it in winter. You just had to know where to put your hand. She stood up from this creek bank and dried her palm on her coat and walked back up the slope toward her house, the house that was hers now fully and legally and without condition, the house where Emerson had lived and where she intended to go on living on the land that the earth had helped her keep by offering up the only warmth it had to give. The valley was quiet around her. The aspens on the upper ridge had turned to gold. The smoke from the houses of Providence Flats rose straight up into the still autumn air, unhurried and no particular danger. It was a good valley. She had decided to stay.